It begins with a small, seemingly unremarkable package. At first glance, it's nothing but a simple object tucked into an environment where it doesn't quite belong. No grand warning, no immediate sense of danger, just something a person might pick up out of curiosity. Perhaps it's lying in a hallway at a university or waiting in the recesses of a mailroom. Someone sees it, finds it strange, and maybe draws closer. The world doesn't know yet, but this innocuous item is about to detonate a decades-long nightmare. A chain of events weaving fear, intellectual fury, and meticulous cunning into one of the longest and most perplexing manhunts in American history. Before the eyes of any unsuspecting victim can fully register what's happening, the device springs its awful surprise. A sudden, violent burst, a concussion of force and shrapnel, leaves confusion and injury in its wake. As authorities rush in, they confront a scene both baffling and chilling. A homemade bomb, expertly crafted from crude materials and disguised in unexpected ways, has targeted a place devoted to knowledge. This is not an accident. This is a deliberate assault on minds and institutions, and it heralds the arrival of a figure who will, for nearly 2 decades, outsmart and outmaneuver the country's most seasoned investigators. In these early days, few can grasp the pattern. The first explosive turns up in the late 1970s, and it's easy to think of it as an isolated event. Perhaps some disgruntled individual seeking revenge, a lone act that, while terrifying, might not repeat. But then, as time moves forward, another bomb appears, then another. The targets vary: universities, airlines, professors, individuals linked to fields of technology and modern advancement. No one receives a friendly warning. Sometimes the victims are injured. Sometimes they narrowly escape. Investigators notice an evolving sophistication. Initially, the devices are rough, even clumsy, but they soon become more intricate, more intelligent, leaving fewer fingerprints, fewer clues. The signature of this phantom bomber emerges. Meticulously carved wooden parts, carefully whittled components, a strange monogram, deceptive markings, all designed to confuse authorities and defy easy patterns. At first, the press and investigators don't know what to call this elusive villain. Eventually, the FBI christens the case with a code name derived from the initial targets, Unabomber, short for university and airline bomber. It's a shorthand that will become famous worldwide, eventually morphing into the public name Unabomber. As the 1980s roll into the 1990s, fear and frustration mount. This isn't just a criminal who can be predicted or cornered easily. This is someone who seems to understand the system from within, someone with a razor-sharp intellect and a deep hatred for the direction of modern civilization. Letters taunt the authorities. Odd scribblings show up, hinting at a twisted worldview. The bombs keep coming, irregular but persistent, like a lingering threat that never quite fades away. Throughout this period, the Unabomber remains a ghost. Law enforcement pores over every detail. They measure the exact lengths of nails, test the chemical residue left by explosives, analyze any possible forensics from envelopes or stamps. They begin to theorize who this person might be. He might be a man with strong ideological motives, not just a random terrorist. Maybe a former academic, possibly linked to the institutions he is targeting. The FBI forms a massive task force, devoting years of manpower to deciphering every cryptic clue. They create psychological profiles, speculate about age, race, education, and motive. Thousands of leads pour in, but nothing solidifies into a clear suspect. He is careful. He leaves almost no trace of DNA. He constructs his devices from scrap and junk that can't be traced back to specific stores. He's cunning in a way that suggests an unusual intellect, certainly not the average criminal. Across America, anxiety grows. The Unabomber's devices have struck without mercy. From airline officials to technology professionals, from genetic researchers to university professors, some are severely injured. A few lose their lives to shrapnel, to flames, or the blast's raw force. The public begins to fear that anywhere science or modern industry thrives could become a target. This is not a battle over money, nor is it a conventional political struggle. It seems to be a war against the very trajectory of human progress. In the midst of this chaos, one detail slowly emerges. The bombs are not random. They reflect a philosophy, a set of beliefs about the destructive nature of industrial society and technology's tightening grip on human life. Eventually, this hidden figure makes a demand. He reaches out to the press, insisting that if a certain lengthy manifesto is published in major newspapers, the attacks will cease. Imagine the tension this creates. Do you give a terrorist a platform to spread ideology, or do you risk more killings by refusing him? The authorities weigh the moral costs. The press debates. The public wonders if understanding this man's mind might help end the violence, or if it might encourage others. This manifesto is no simple rant. It is a dense, carefully written document that critiques industrial civilization, mass technology, and the systems that erode human freedom. It reads like a blend of academic treatise and revolutionary pamphlet. Whoever wrote it is not only literate and educated but also deeply acquainted with philosophical and socio-political thought. The manifesto, which will later become famous as Industrial Society and Its Future, lays out its author's belief that modern technology is destroying the fabric of human autonomy and dignity. The idea is radical, anti-modern, and vehemently opposed to the direction humanity has taken since the Industrial Revolution. As the FBI struggles with the moral and strategic puzzle of publishing the manifesto, they also see a glimmer of opportunity. With a large body of text available, there might be linguistic fingerprints. Perhaps someone out there will read these words and recognize the voice behind them. This is a bold gamble. Rely on the subtle markers in a person's writing style, the cadence, the choice of phrases, the peculiar way of forming arguments, to identify him. The manifesto is indeed published, making headlines across the nation. Millions of people read it. Some are intrigued, others are horrified, and some consider it the ramblings of a madman. But somewhere, in a quiet corner of America, a family member of the bomber will read these lines and feel a terrible chill of recognition. Midway through this search, if you find the details compelling and want to remain informed whenever we explore similar intricate stories, consider subscribing. Let's continue. Enter David Kaczynski, a man who, as he pores over the published manifesto, cannot deny the eerie familiarity. The phrasing, the arguments, the unique linguistic tics, these remind him of his estranged older brother, Ted. Theodore John Kaczynski, a brilliant mathematician who, decades before, had shown immense promise, even securing a position as an assistant professor at the University of California, Berkeley. Yet Ted had abandoned that career, disappearing from the academic world to live as a hermit in a small cabin in rural Montana. He had been a gifted child, someone who had entered Harvard at an extremely young age, someone who showed dazzling talent in complex mathematics. But somewhere along the line, he'd grown disillusioned with the modern world, retreating into isolation to nurture his contempt for the march of technology and industrialization. Over the years, Ted had severed ties, preferring solitude and self-sufficiency. He seemed odd, distant, and profoundly critical of the direction civilization was heading. David, unsettled and anguished, wrestles with the thought, could his own brother, that quiet, reclusive intellectual who once seemed simply eccentric, be responsible for a near 20-year bombing campaign that left blood and fear scattered across the nation? The weight of such a suspicion is enormous. Yet the more he compares Ted's earlier writings, letters, and communications with the manifesto's content, the more he becomes convinced. He makes a painful choice. Seeking the guidance of his wife and eventually law enforcement, David approaches the FBI, providing them with samples of Ted's writing for comparison. In doing so, he risks betraying his own brother. But the moral imperative is clear. Lives are at stake, and the country is ensnared by terror. The FBI pounces on this lead. After years of fruitless searching, after so many false profiles and dead ends, they finally have a concrete suspect. They analyze Ted's old letters. They consult expert linguists. The patterns match. Everything lines up. The intellectual style, the reclusive lifestyle, the disdain for modern society. Soon, agents are making quiet plans to apprehend this man who has taunted them from the shadows for so long. Picture the final confrontation. It's 1996. Deep in the Montana woods, in a rustic cabin without electricity or running water, Ted Kaczynski lives a life that is the polar opposite of modern convenience. His home is cramped, cluttered with notebooks, tools, and scraps. Little do neighbors suspect that this quiet hermit is the most wanted bomber in the United States. As the FBI converges, they take every precaution. They fear the cabin might be rigged with explosives. Agents dress in disguise, posing as forest workers, and at the right moment, they spring into action. Kaczynski is taken by surprise and overpowered before he can detonate any hidden devices. Inside the cabin, investigators discover a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. Bomb-making materials, handwritten drafts of the manifesto, journals detailing his crimes, and notes that match the language of the letters sent to newspapers. The careful facade that lasted for decades collapses instantly. The Unabomber has a face and a name, and he is finally in custody. Now the world learns who Ted Kaczynski is. Born in 1942, he was a child prodigy who skipped grades, entered Harvard at 16, and earned a PhD in mathematics. His early work showed brilliance, and for a brief time, he lectured on complex subjects that few could fully grasp. Yet, despite his intellectual gifts, he was deeply troubled by the direction society was taking. After resigning from Berkeley, he withdrew from the world, building a life off the grid, hunting his own food, and reading widely in philosophy, ecology, and political theory. From that isolated vantage point, he concluded that technology enslaved humanity, stripping individuals of autonomy and dignity. Rather than simply criticizing, he took a path of violence, believing terror would force society to confront his ideas. Over 17 years, he mailed or placed 16 bombs, killing 3 people and injuring more than 20 others. His targets ranged from university professors to advertising executives, people symbolizing the system he despised. The trial that followed could have been a grand stage for ideological debate, but it didn't play out that way. Initially, the government pursued the death penalty. Kaczynski's defense team prepared an argument focusing on his mental state, suggesting paranoid schizophrenia or other conditions that might mitigate responsibility. Ted resisted being pathologized. He hated the idea of his actions being reduced to madness rather than principle. He even attempted to dismiss his lawyers to represent himself. Yet after lengthy negotiations, he pleaded guilty in 1998, accepting a life sentence without the possibility of parole, thereby avoiding the death penalty. He would spend his remaining years in a federal prison cell. This resolution left many people uneasy. Some saw him as a vicious murderer driven by twisted logic. Others acknowledged the intellectual content of his manifesto, even if they abhorred his methods, arguing that his critique of industrial society raised important questions, though delivered in a monstrous way. Yet, no matter how one views his ideas, the cruelty of mailing bombs to unsuspecting victims overshadowed any philosophical weight. Ted Kaczynski became a cautionary tale. A brilliant mind corroded by hatred and isolation, a man who could have contributed to society through scholarship, but instead chose to wage war against it. In the years following his imprisonment, the name Unabomber entered the cultural lexicon. Investigations revealed that he meticulously concealed his identity. He learned from each bombing, refining his techniques, improving his evasion tactics, and eliminating telltale evidence. He even left false clues to mislead investigators, at times planting items on his bombs to suggest they were made by someone who didn't speak English fluently, or someone working in a different region. He'd scavenge materials from random sources, making sure nothing could be traced to a specific store or supplier. He knew enough about law enforcement techniques to keep them guessing. The scope of the FBI investigation was immense. At one point, the Unabomber task force spent tens of millions of dollars on the manhunt. Psychologists, linguists, forensic experts. Everyone took a shot at decoding the phantom bomber's identity. Yet it was his own words, ironically, that led to his downfall. By insisting on the publication of the manifesto, he provided a key that only someone close to him could use. When people learned more about Ted's background, they often pointed to his time as a student at Harvard and his involvement in a psychological study that some believe may have contributed to his growing alienation. During these experiments, conducted by a psychologist who worked with the CIA's MKUltra mind control research, Ted and other students were subjected to harsh criticism and personal attacks on their beliefs. While it's impossible to draw a straight line from these events to his acts of terror, some speculate that this period played a role in shaping his fierce resentment toward authority and institutions. Still, there's no justification for what he did. Many people suffer hardships or disillusionment without resorting to murder. Over time, Kaczynski remained a figure of grim fascination. His ideas about technological society resonate in some fringe communities, and his manifesto circulates online. Environmental extremists and anarchists sometimes cite him as a dark prophet, though most people reject his violent methods wholeheartedly. He became a piece of Americana, referenced in films, literature, and cultural commentary, a symbol of how far one can fall from humanistic ideals into a pit of brutality. Ted's capture and sentencing did not immediately erase the tension his bombs created, but it did bring a sense of closure. People no longer had to worry about opening a package that might maim or kill. Academics and professionals who work in fields he despised, genetics, aviation, computer science, could breathe a little easier. The FBI had brought down one of its longest-running adversaries. The case also proved the value of linguistics and the involvement of the public. Without David Kaczynski's recognition of his brother's prose, who knows how much longer the Unabomber would have remained free. For 2 decades, Ted Kaczynski's name remained etched in the American psyche as the face of a ruthless crusade against modernity. His critique of technology, which might have been a subject for intellectual debate had he chosen a peaceful route, instead became poisoned by bloodshed. There is an enduring lesson in his story. Even the most intelligent person, if guided by rage and isolation, can commit unthinkable crimes. Complexity of thought does not guarantee moral integrity. Kaczynski's fall from academic genius to domestic terrorist stands as a stark reminder that intellect alone does not equate to wisdom or empathy. As the years passed, the world only grew more dependent on technology. The internet boomed, smartphones proliferated, and genetic engineering advanced in ways previously unimaginable. Society did not turn back from the technological frontier. If anything, it charged forward. Kaczynski's efforts to halt the tide of progress failed spectacularly. All he managed to do was cause suffering, spark fear, and leave scars on families. The legacy he left behind is not one of heroic resistance but of pointless violence. In 2023, after spending decades behind bars, Ted Kaczynski was found dead in his prison cell. The reported cause was suicide. Even in death, he remained something of an enigma. He left behind letters and writings, but no apology, no renunciation of his methods. He died as he lived after his arrest. Alone, confined, surrounded by concrete and steel, a relic of a past terror that had once gripped a nation. The Unabomber's story is a long cautionary tale, a demonstration that extreme ideology, when paired with the will and skill to harm, can disrupt countless lives. But his downfall also illustrates that even the cleverest criminal can be caught, and often it's human insight that cracks the case. All the analytical tools, forensic science, and bureaucratic machinery of law enforcement could not solve the mystery for years. Instead, it was the human recognition of a brother's voice in a torrent of hateful philosophy that ended the reign of terror. If this account leaves you contemplative, feel free to acknowledge it by liking the video and subscribing. And that is the full legacy of the Unabomber. A man who tried to reshape society through terror and failed. A mind that could have offered brilliance to the world but instead delivered tragedy. And a figure who, despite all his cunning, was undone when his own words gave him away.